Comrades, the system appears eternal, not because it is eternal, but because it has taught you to mistake endurance for inevitability. You wake beneath it, you labor within it, you age under its discipline. And so you are told it must be natural. But nothing that is built by human hands is beyond human transformation. The present order, this architecture of wages, profits, debts, and hierarchies, does not stand because it is immortal. It stands because it is enforced. It stands because it organizes not only factories and markets, but also minds. It persuades you that what exists has always existed, and what has always existed must always remain. This is its most brilliant deception. In the Communist Manifesto, it is written that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, not the history of harmony, not the history of gradual improvement, but struggle between those who own and those who labor, between those who command and those who obey. The system feels permanent because it conceals this struggle. It presents exploitation as opportunity. It presents wage labor as freedom. It presents private property as civilization itself. And in doing so, it hides the simple truth that wealth is produced by the many and appropriated by the few. Look closely at the structure of this society. The worker sells labor power in order to survive. The capitalist purchases that labor power not out of generosity, but because it produces more value than it costs. This surplus, this unpaid labor, becomes profit. The worker creates it, the capitalist claims it, and the law protects this arrangement as sacred. This is not an accident, it is the logic of capitalism. Yet the system does not merely extract surplus value, it extracts belief. It teaches the worker to see this exchange as fair. It teaches the oppressed to compete against one another. It fragments solidarity and elevates individual survival as the highest moral good. Thus, the system feels permanent because it is reproduced daily, not only in factories and offices, but in schools, in media, in culture, in the very language used to describe reality. You are told there is no alternative. You are told work harder. You are told the market decides. But markets do not decide. Classes decide. The ruling ideas of any age are the ideas of its ruling class. When you believe that inequality is natural, when you believe that poverty is personal failure, when you believe that billionaires are innovators rather than beneficiaries of collective labor, you are witnessing ideology at work. And yet, history mocks permanence. Feudalism once appeared eternal. Kings claimed divine right. Lords commanded land and loyalty. The peasant could scarcely imagine a world without a master. But the very development of production, of trade, of industry, undermined the old order. The bourgeoisie rose. The feudal system collapsed. What felt immovable shattered. Why? Because every mode of production contains its own contradictions. Capitalism is no exception. It centralizes wealth while socializing labor. Millions work together to produce goods, services, technologies. Yet the fruits of this collective effort are privately owned. The worker becomes alienated from the product, from the process, from fellow workers, and ultimately from self. Human creativity is reduced to a commodity. This contradiction deepens with every crisis. Economic crashes reveal what prosperity conceals, that the system is unstable by design. Overproduction occurs not because there is too much for human need, but because there is too little purchasing power among those who produce. Goods sit unsold, factories close, workers are dismissed, not because society has no needs, but because profit has fallen. The system trembles under the weight of its own logic, and in those moments, when wages stagnate, when debt suffocates, when the promise of stability dissolves, The illusion of permanence begins to crack. But understand this clearly. Systems do not collapse automatically. They are overthrown. History does not move because it is tired. It moves because people organize. The bourgeoisie did not politely request power from feudal lords. It seized it through economic and political struggle. Likewise, the working class will not inherit liberation through patience. It must recognize itself as a class, not as isolated individuals competing for scraps, but as a collective force whose labor sustains the entire structure. Without workers, not a wheel turns, not a light shines, not a machine hums, not a profit is made. You are told you are replaceable, yet the entire edifice depends upon you. The permanence of the system is sustained by division, by race, by nationality, by gender, by artificial hierarchies that distract from the fundamental antagonism between labour and capital. As long as workers see one another as rivals, the ruling class rests securely. But when workers see one another as comrades, the ground begins to shake. Do not underestimate the power of consciousness. When a worker understands exploitation not as personal misfortune, but as structural necessity, when the veil of ideology is lifted, obedience transforms into inquiry, inquiry into anger, anger into organization. Trade unions, political movements, cooperative institutions, these are not mere reforms. They are schools of struggle. They teach solidarity. They transform scattered frustration into collective power, and as organization grows, so too does possibility. The system feels permanent because it controls the present, but it cannot control the future once the masses withdraw consent. Remember, every ruling class in history believed its dominance to be final. Every empire proclaimed eternity. Yet none survived the awakening of those it oppressed. Capitalism has expanded across continents. It has revolutionized production, reshaped cities, connected markets. But in doing so, it has also created its gravedigger, the proletariat, united not by tradition, but by shared exploitation. The worker in one country competes with the worker in another, not by choice, but by design. Capital moves freely across borders. Labor is divided, yet the conditions of exploitation are strikingly similar. Long hours, precarious employment, rising costs, concentrated wealth. The system's global reach creates the material basis for global solidarity. The question is not whether capitalism will face crisis. It always does. The question is whether the working class will be prepared, organized, conscious, united, when that crisis exposes the fragility behind the facade. For the system feels permanent until it suddenly isn't, until the strike spreads, until the streets fill, until the oppressed refuse compliance, until the machinery of profit grinds to a halt. In that moment, what seemed unchangeable reveals itself as contingent. And then history accelerates. But let there be no romanticism. Transformation demands discipline, clarity, and collective action. It requires dismantling not only economic structures, but the ideological chains that bind the imagination. It demands courage to envision a society in which production serves human need, not private accumulation, in which the wealth created by all is shared by all. N.W. Hitch labor is not coerced by hunger, but organized freely for the common good. Such a society is not utopian fantasy. It is the logical resolution of capitalism's contradictions. The permanence of the present order is a myth sustained by habit and fear. Once those dissolve, what remains is possibility. Comrades, the system appears immovable because you have been taught to endure it. But endurance is not destiny. The same hands that build the world can rebuild it. Do not ask whether change is realistic. Ask whether exploitation is tolerable. Do not ask whether the system is strong. Ask whether your unity is stronger. History waits not for patience, but for participation. And when the working class ceases to endure, when it organizes, educates, agitates, the permanence of the system will vanish like smoke before a rising storm. The system feels permanent until the people decide it is not. The illusion of permanence is not born from the strength of the system alone. It is cultivated through ideology and sustained through the quiet, repetitive rituals of everyday life. Capitalism does not rely solely on police, courts, or armies to endure. Its deeper defense lies in the shaping of consciousness. It teaches individuals to perceive its structures not as historical arrangements, but as natural facts. Wages become synonymous with survival. Competition becomes synonymous with ambition. Private property becomes synonymous with freedom. Through this ideological transformation, what is historically specific begins to feel timeless. Ideology operates most effectively when it is invisible. It does not always shout. It whispers, it speaks through schools that prepare children not to question labor markets, but to enter them. It speaks through media that celebrates wealth as merit and poverty as failure. It speaks through political discourse that narrows imagination to men, or reforms while declaring systemic change impossible. The worker is encouraged to see the employer not as a beneficiary of surplus value, but as a job creator. The corporation is portrayed not as a structure of extraction, but as a source of innovation. These narratives are repeated until they harden into common sense. This common sense is the architecture of permanence. When people internalize the logic of the system, they participate in its reproduction without coercion. Each morning, millions rise not because they are chained, but because rent is due, food must be purchased, and healthcare is commodified. The necessity of survival compels participation in wage labor. In selling labor power, workers reproduce the very relations that subordinate them. The factory, the office, the warehouse, the digital platform, each becomes a site where capitalist relations are enacted and renewed. The reproduction of capitalism is not only economic, but social. Families are structured around the wage. Urban spaces are designed around production and consumption. Time itself is divided into shifts, deadlines, quarters, and fiscal years. Even leisure becomes commodified, transformed into an industry that profits from exhaustion. In this way, capitalism does not merely organize work, it organizes life. Its rhythms infiltrate thought patterns, expectations, and aspirations. Children grow up imagining careers, not collective ownership. Not collective ownership. Success is framed as upward mobility within the system rather than transformation of the system itself. The illusion of permanence strengthens because alternatives are systematically marginalized. When cooperative forms of production emerge, they are forced to compete within the same market logic. When social movements demand structural change, they are absorbed into electoral cycles or fragmented by cultural divisions. The system adapts, reforms at the edges, and presents these adjustments as proof of its flexibility. This adaptability reinforces the belief that while problems may exist, the framework itself is unassailable. Language plays a decisive role in this process. Economic crises are described as downturns rather than systemic failures. Layoffs are called restructuring. Exploitation is reframed as productivity. By renaming realities, ideology softens contradictions. The worker who struggles to pay bills is told to improve skills. The community devastated by deindustrialization is told to attract investment. Structural inequality is translated into personal responsibility. Through this linguistic shift, systemic critique, is redirected into individual self-improvement, the daily reproduction of capitalist relations also depends on division. Workers are segmented by nationality, race, gender, and employment status. Full-time workers are separated from gig workers, documented workers from undocumented, citizens from migrants. These divisions fragment solidarity and channel frustration laterally rather than upward. When workers compete against one another for scarce opportunities, they inadvertently reinforce the system that manufactures scarcity. Ideology frames this competition as natural, disguising the artificial constraints imposed by private accumulation. Technological development further intensifies this illusion. Automation, digital platforms, and global supply chains create the impression of complexity beyond comprehension. The system appears too vast, too interconnected, too technical to challenge. Expertise is centralized, and economic governance is presented as the domain of specialists rather than citizens. This mystification distances ordinary people from the mechanisms that govern their lives. What is opaque seems inevitable. What is inevitable seems permanent, yet beneath this facade lies a sigh. Memorable reality. The system persists because it is enacted daily through human activity. Every transaction, every contract, every shift completed reinforces the pattern. The illusion of permanence depends on routine. It depends on routine. It depends on workers believing that participation is unavoidable and that alternatives are unrealistic. Ideology does not merely justify exploitation. It normalizes it. It embeds it within habits so deeply that questioning it feels abnormal. The permanence of capitalism is therefore psychological as much as material. It survives because people cannot easily imagine a society organized differently. The boundaries of possibility are policed not only by institutions but by expectations. When imagination is constrained, obedience follows without visible force. The worker may resent exploitation, but resentment without analysis remains isolated. Without recognizing the systemic nature of exploitation, dissatisfaction becomes private despair rather than collective consciousness. In this way, ideology and daily reproduction intertwine. The system shapes thought, and thought sustains the system. Each reinforces the other in a continuous cycle. The illusion endures not because capitalism is without contradiction, but because those contradictions are masked by routine and rationalized by belief. Only when the veil of ideology is pierced and the mechanisms of daily reproduction are understood as historical constructs does the appearance of permanence begin to fracture. All history is the history of class struggle between labor and capital, not because conflict is an accident of human nature, but because the organization of production has always divided society into those who work and those who control the conditions of work. From the earliest forms of settled agriculture to the sprawling industrial metropolises of modern capitalism, the central question has remained. Unchanged: who owns and who labors, who commands and who obeys, who accumulates and who survives. The names of the classes have shifted across centuries, but the antagonism persists, rooted in material conditions rather than moral failings. In ancient societies, masters and slaves stood opposed. The slave's labor produced wealth, yet the slave possessed neither property nor autonomy. The ruling class justified domination through mythology, law, and force, presenting hierarchy as destiny. In feudal Europe, lords and serfs occupied similar positions within a different structure. The serf cultivated land owned by the lord, surrendering a portion of labor and produce in exchange for subsistence and protection. Again, the economic arrangement defines social life, political power, and cultural norms. Religion sanctified obedience. tradition reinforced hierarchy. What appeared eternal was in fact contingent upon specific modes of production. With the rise of commerce and industry, feudal bonds began to fracture. A new class emerged, the bourgeoisie, whose power derived not from land but from capital. Factories replaced manors, wage labor replaced serfdom, yet the essential division endured. The proletariat, stripped of ownership of the means of production, could survive only by selling labor power to those who possessed capital. Labor became commodified, measured in hours and exchanged for wages. Capital accumulated through the extraction of surplus value. The difference between what labor produced and what labor was paid. This extraction was not incidental, but structural, embedded in the very mechanics of capitalist exchange. The struggle between labor and capital is not confined to strikes or revolutions. It unfolds daily in negotiations over wages, working hours, safety, and conditions. Every demand for higher pay challenges the portion of surplus appropriated by capital. Every attempt by employers to lengthen the working day intensifies exploitation. Laws governing unions, minimum wages, and property rights reflect temporary outcomes of this ongoing conflict. The state, often presented as neutral, operates within a framework shaped by the dominant class, protecting property relations, while mediating unrest. Class struggle extends beyond the factory floor. It influences education systems designed to prepare individuals for roles within the labor market. It shapes urban planning, where housing for workers is often separated from centers of wealth. It permeates culture, where narratives of meritocracy obscure structural inequalities. Even technological innovation, celebrated as progress, frequently serves to increase productivity while displacing workers or intensifying surveillance. Machinery becomes both a tool of efficiency and a means of discipline, subordinating human rhythms to industrial tempo. Capitalism intensifies class struggle through its global reach. Capital flows across borders in search of cheaper labor and higher returns, while workers remain constrained by nationality and immigration controls. This asymmetry strengthens capital's bargaining power and fragments labor solidarity. Factories close in one region and reopen in another, pitting workers against one another in a competition not of their choosing. The global supply chain becomes a network through which exploitation is distributed yet interconnected, linking miners, assembly line workers, logistics operators, and service employees in a shared but uneven system. Crises expose the depth of this antagonism. Economic downturns reveal that production under capitalism is oriented toward profit rather than need. Goods may remain unsold while people lack essentials, not because resources are insufficient, but because purchasing power is limited by wage constraint, as workers are laid off to preserve profitability, demonstrating that their livelihoods are subordinate to capital accumulation. These crises are not aberrations, they are expressions of systemic contradictions. Overproduction and underconsumption coexist, driven by the imperative to expand capital endlessly within finite markets. Resistance arises wherever exploitation sharpens. Trade unions form to negotiate collectively rather than individually. Political movements demand reforms or systemic transformation. Strikes disrupt production, revealing labor's centrality to economic life. Each act of resistance underscores the reality that without labor, capital is inert. Machines do not operate themselves. Commodities do not transport themselves. Services do not provide themselves. Services do not provide themselves. The workers' collective withdrawal of labor exposes the dependence of capital on those it exploits. Ideology attempts to soften or conceal this struggle. Workers are encouraged to identify with companies, to view themselves as entrepreneurs of their own labor, to measure worth by productivity. Success stories are elevated to suggest mobility is universally attainable, masking structural barriers. Yet beneath these narratives, the fundamental division persists. The accumulation of wealth at the top contrasts with stagnating wages and precarious employment below. The concentration of ownership intensifies, consolidating power within fewer hands. Class struggle is not merely economic, but political. The question of who controls production determines who shapes policy, law, and social priorities. When capital influences legislation, tax structures, and trade agreements, it reinforces its dominance. When labor organizes politically, it seeks to redistribute power and redefine the terms of production. The tension between these forces drives historical transformation, altering institutions and socia. History advances not through harmony, but through this dynamic of conflict. Each dominant class generates conditions that eventually undermine its supremacy. Feudalism gave rise to the bourgeoisie. Capitalism produces the proletariat as a collective force. As productive capacity expands and contradictions intensify, the struggle between labor and capital deepens, shaping the trajectory of societies and redefining the possibilities of economic and social organization. Capitalism's internal contradictions make crisis inevitable because the system is driven by forces that both sustain and destabilize it at the same time. It is organized around private ownership of the means of production, yet it depends on collective labor to generate wealth. It demands continuous expansion, yet it operates within finite social and material limits. It pursues profit as its highest objective, yet profit itself is extracted from the very labor whose purchasing power it persistently suppresses. These tensions are not external shocks imposed upon an otherwise stable order. They are woven into its structure. At the heart of capitalism lies the extraction of surplus value. Workers are paid wages equivalent to a portion of the value they create, while the remaining value is appropriated as profit. Each capitalist enterprise competes with others, seeking to increase efficiency, reduce costs, and expand market share. This competition drives innovation, mechanization, and technological advancement. While such developments increase productivity, they also reduce the relative reliance on human labor, which is the sole source of surplus value. As machinery replaces workers or intensifies their output, the proportion of capital invested in equipment rises relative to that invested in labor. Over time, this dynamic places downward pressure on the rate of profit, creating instability within the system. The pursuit of profit also compels capitalists to suppress wages wherever possible. Lower wages mean higher immediate returns. Yet wages constitute the primary source of purchasing power for the majority. When wages stagnate or decline, the capacity of workers to buy the goods they produce diminishes. Production continues to expand, driven by competition and the need for growth, but consumption cannot keep pace. The result is overproduction. Not an excess of goods relative to human need, but an excess relative to effective demand within the market. Warehouses fill, inventories accumulate, and prices fall. Companies respond by cutting output and laying off workers, further reducing purchasing power and deepening the downturn. Credit temporarily masks this contradiction. By extending loans to consumers and businesses, financial institutions enable spending beyond immediate income. Debt sustains consumption and investment, allowing growth to continue despite wage constraints. However, credit expansion cannot eliminate underlying imbalances, it merely postpones their consequences. When debts become unsustainable, defaults spread, financial institutions falter, and panic reverberates through markets. What appeared as prosperity reveals itself as fragile expansion built upon leverage. Another contradiction emerges in the global dimension of capitalism. Capital seeks new markets and cheaper labor across borders, integrating distant regions into a single economic network. This expansion increases output and profitability, but also spreads vulnerability. A disruption in one sector or country can cascade through supply chains, affecting industries worldwide. Global interdependence magnifies the scale of crises, transforming localized downturns into systemic shocks. At the same time, international competition pressures governments to reduce labor protections and social spending to attract investment, intensifying inequality and social tension. Technological advancement further intensifies contradictions. Automation increases productivity and reduces costs, yet it displaces workers and concentrates income among those who own capital and intellectual property. As wealth accumulates at the top, inequality widens. High-income households cannot consume enough to absorb total production, while low-income households struggle with limited means. The imbalance between production capacity and mass purchasing power grows sharper. What is celebrated as progress becomes a source of instability when the benefits of innovation are unevenly distributed. Environmental limits introduce another layer of contradiction. Capitalism's imperative for endless growth collides with ecological constraints. Natural resources are extracted and commodified to sustain production, often without regard for long-term sustainability. Environmental degradation imposes social costs, health crises, displacement, climate disruption that the market fails to account for adequately. Efforts to address these issues can conflict with short-term profitability, creating tension between ecological necessity and economic incentives. Political contradictions accompany economic ones. The state is tasked with maintaining conditions favorable to capital accumulation while also preserving social stability. During crises, governments intervene through bailouts, stimulus packages, or regulatory adjustments to prevent systemic collapse. Such interventions reveal that the market is not self-sustaining. Yet they also reinforce perceptions of inequality when public resources are used to stabilize private institutions. Popular discontent grows as citizens witness socialized losses and privatized gains. The cyclical nature of crises reflects these intertwined contradictions. Periods of fifth expansion generate optimism and investment, but they also sow the seeds of contraction through overproduction, excessive debt, and speculative bubbles. When contraction arrives, unemployment rises, businesses fail, and social unrest intensifies. Recovery eventually follows, driven by restructuring, devaluation of capital, and renewed investment, only to begin the cycle anew. The repetition of this pattern underscores that instability is not an anomaly but an intrinsic feature. Competition, which propels dynamism, simultaneously produces concentration of capital. Large firms absorb or eliminate smaller competitors, leading to monopolistic or oligopolistic structures. This concentration enhances pricing power and political influence, distorting markets and amplifying inequality. As economic power consolidates, democratic institutions may weaken under the weight of corporate influence, creating further tension between economic structures and political ideals. These contradictions interact rather than operate in isolation. Wage suppression feeds overproduction, technological displacement exacerbates inequality. Global expansion spreads instability, environmental degradation intensifies social costs, financialization magnifies volatility. Each effort to resolve one tension often deepens another. The system adapts through reform, innovation, and state intervention. Yet adaptation does not abolish contradiction. it reshapes and postpones it, allowing imbalances to accumulate beneath the surface of apparent stability. Class consciousness transforms isolated suffering into collective power by revealing that what appears to be personal failure is in fact structural design. Under capitalism, exploitation is experienced individually. A worker struggles to pay rent and assumes inadequacy. Another is dismissed from employment and internalizes blame. A third labors long hours, it remains trapped in debt, and believes effort alone will eventually secure stability. Each person confronts hardship as if it were unique, disconnected from the broader system. This fragmentation is not incidental. It is essential to the preservation of existing relations. When suffering is privatized, resistance remains paralyzed. Class consciousness begins with recognition. It emerges when workers understand that their conditions are not accidents, but outcomes of a shared economic structure. Low wages, precarious contracts, rising living costs, and diminishing security are not isolated misfortunes. They are expressions of a system organized around profit rather than need. This realization alters perception. The worker ceases to see exploitation as destiny and begins to see it as a relationship. The employer's gain corresponds to the worker's deprivation. Surplus value extracted from labor becomes visible as the foundation of wealth accumulation. What was once obscured by routine and ideology becomes intelligible. This transformation is intellectual, but it is also emotional. Isolation breeds resignation. When individuals believe they suffer alone, they endure in silence. Class consciousness replaces silence with solidarity. The recognition that others share the same conditions dissolves shame and replaces it with anger directed not inward but outward. Anger, when grounded in analysis, becomes disciplined rather than chaotic. It fuels organization rather than despair. The worker who once competed with colleagues for scarce promotions begins to see those colleagues as allies confronting the same constraints. Capitalism thrives on division. It segments workers by occupation, nationality, race, gender, and contract status. These divisions fragment the workforce and channel frustration horizontally. Class consciousness challenges this fragmentation by identifying a common position within the relations of production. The factory worker, the service employee, the delivery driver, and the office clerk may perform different tasks, yet all depend on selling labor power to survive. All contribute to value creation. All experience varying degrees of alienation from the products and processes of their work. Recognizing this shared condition undermines the narratives that pit them against one another. Education plays a decisive role in fostering this awareness. Not education confined to formal institutions alone, but education through experience, discussion, and struggle. When workers analyze wage structures, corporate profits, and labor laws, they uncover patterns that reveal systemic exploitation. When they study historical movements, strikes, unions, revolutions, they see evidence that collective action has altered conditions before. Knowledge becomes a tool of empowerment. It equips individuals to interpret their reality critically rather than accept it passively. Organization converts consciousness into material force. A single worker refusing unfair treatment may be dismissed. A collective refusal disrupts production. Strikes demonstrate that labor is not merely a factor of production, but the living source of it. When workers coordinate their actions, they expose the dependence of capital on their cooperation. Factories halt, services pause, supply chains stall. What appeared as the natural flow of economic life is revealed as contingent upon collective human activity. This revelation shifts the balance of power. Class consciousness also reshapes political engagement. Instead of viewing politics as distant spectacle, Workers begin to see it as terrain of struggle over material interests. Policies concerning wages, taxation, healthcare, housing, and labor rights become expressions of class power. Participation expands beyond voting to include organizing, campaigning, and forming independent associations. The state is no longer perceived as neutral arbiter, but as an institution shaped by prevailing economic forces. Demands for reform or transformation are articulated not as pleas for charity, but as assertions of collective entitlement. The process is not instantaneous. Consciousness develops unevenly, influenced by economic cycles and social movements. Periods of crisis often accelerate awareness as contradictions become visible and promises of stability dissolve. Conversations once dismissed as radical gain resonance when daily life exposes systemic limits. The experience of shared vulnerability during downturns fosters dialogue and coordination. Through meetings, assemblies, and networks, isolated grievances converge into unified demands. Cultural expression contributes to this awakening. Art, literature, music, and media that depict working class realities counter dominant narratives of individual success. They validate experiences of exploitation and articulate visions of solidarity. Culture becomes arena of contestation, where competing interpretations of society struggle for dominance. When workers see their lives reflected honestly rather than distorted, identification deepens and confidence grows. Class consciousness does not eliminate diversity within the working class, but it situates differences within a broader framework of common interests. It recognizes that specific forms of oppression intersect with economic exploitation, reinforcing vulnerability. Solidarity expands when workers understand that liberation requires confronting all structures that divide and weaken collective strength. Unity becomes strategic rather than sentimental, grounded in material interdependence. As consciousness spreads, fear recedes. The sense of inevitability surrounding the existing order weakens. Workers begin to imagine alternatives, cooperative ownership, democratic workplaces, socialized production oriented toward human need. Imagination, once constrained by ideology, opens toward possibility. What was endured as permanent becomes visible as historical and therefore alterable. Isolated suffering, once internalized as personal inadequacy, transforms into shared resolve, into organized energy, into collective power capable of reshaping institutions and redefining the conditions of social life. Organized workers hold the power to dismantle and rebuild the system, because they are the living force that animates it. Capital by itself is inert. Machines do not generate value without hands to operate them. Algorithms do not circulate commodities without minds to design and maintain them. Infrastructure does not sustain society without labor to construct and repair it. Every industry, from agriculture to technology, depends upon human effort, coordinated across countless roles. When workers recognize this centrality and act collectively, they confront the fundamental truth that the system relies upon their continued cooperation. Individually, the worker appears powerless. The employment contract frames labor as a voluntary exchange between unequal parties, masking the coercion embedded in economic necessity. One worker can be replaced. Thousands acting together cannot be ignored. Organization transforms vulnerability into leverage. Through unions, councils, assemblies, and federations, workers consolidate their dispersed strength. They negotiate not as isolated sellers of labor power, but as a unified class, asserting collective interests. The employer's authority, which once seemed absolute, becomes conditional upon consent. Strikes reveal this power in its most visible form. When labor withdraws, production halts. Factories fall silent, transportation stalls, pause. The interruption of economic flow exposes how dependent capital is on the very workers it exploits. Profit is not generated by ownership alone, but by the continuous application of labor. Each coordinated refusal to work underscores that wealth accumulation rests on cooperation that can be suspended. The strike is not merely a tactic, it is a demonstration of structural reality. Organization extends beyond the workplace. Workers influence supply chains, distribution networks, and consumer markets. When coordination expands across sectors and regions, isolated disruptions evolve into systemic pressure. Collective bargaining improves wages and conditions, but broader solidarity challenges ownership itself. When workers deliberate on how production should be structured, what should be produced, and for whom, they step into the realm of governance. The system's legitimacy begins to shift from private capital to collective decision-making. Rebuilding requires more than negation. It demands vision and coordination. Organized workers are uniquely positioned to redesign economic relations because they possess practical knowledge of production processes. They understand workflows, logistics, and community needs from lived experience. This knowledge, when democratized and shared, becomes the foundation for alternative structures such as cooperatives, public enterprises, and participatory planning. Production can be oriented towards social necessity rather than profit margins. Resources can be allocated according to collective priorities rather than shareholder returns. The concentration of workers in large industries fosters this capacity. Capitalism assembles labor in centralized workplaces and interconnected networks to maximize efficiency. In doing so, it inadvertently creates the conditions for solidarity. Shared environments cultivate communication and shared grievances. Digital communication further amplifies this connectivity, enabling rapid coordination across geographic boundaries. The same technological integration that enhances capital mobility can facilitate labor organization when harnessed consciously. Political engagement complements economic organization. Workers who unite in workplaces often extend collaboration into the political sphere. They advocate for labor protections, social welfare, and democratic reforms that shift power balances. Through coordinated campaigns and movements, they challenge policies that privilege capital accumulation over human welfare. The state, which often protects existing property relations, becomes terrain of contestation. Organized labor can influence legislation, shape public discourse, and redefine institutional priorities. The process of dismantling does not necessarily imply chaos. It involves systematic transformation. As workers gain influence, they can demand transparency in corporate governance, participation in decision-making, and redistribution of ownership. Cooperative enterprises demonstrate that democratic management is viable. Public control of essential services ensures that basic needs are met without exploitation. Gradual expansion of such models can erode the dominance of private capital while preserving productive capacity. Solidarity across industries and borders strengthens this transformative potential. Capital operates globally, relocating production to regions with lower wages and weaker protections. Organized workers counter this by forging alliances beyond national boundaries, resisting attempts to pit one workforce against another. International cooperation challenges the race to the bottom and asserts shared standards. Unity reduces vulnerability to relocation and strengthens bargaining power. Education within organizations sustains momentum. Discussions about economic structures, history, and strategy cultivate informed participation. Members develop skills in negotiation, administration, and conflict resolution. Leadership rotates and accountability is emphasized to prevent replication of hierarchical domination. Organization becomes not only a tool of resistance, but a training ground for democratic governance. Crises often accelerate this dynamic. Economic downturns reveal systemic fragility and expose inequalities. When traditional institutions falter, organized workers can step forward with coordinated responses, mutual aid networks, and proposals for structural change. Their capacity to mobilize resources and people demonstrates practical alternatives to profit-driven management. Confidence grows as collective action yields tangible improvements. Organized workers embody both the critique and the solution. They experience exploitation directly and possess the collective capacity to alter it. Their labor sustains society. Their cooperation grants legitimacy to economic arrangements. When they withdraw consent and assert coordinated control, the structures that once seemed immovable reveal dependence on collective will. Through disciplined organization, shared analysis, and sustained solidarity, workers hold the capacity to dismantle relations rooted in private accumulation, and to construct systems grounded in democratic control, equitable distribution, and collective stewardship of productive resources. The system has trained you to believe that it is eternal, that its hierarchies are natural, that its hierarchies are unnatural. It has wrapped exploitation in the language of opportunity and masked domination as order. It has taught you to endure, to adapt, to compete, to survive within boundaries it alone has drawn. And because you have lived your entire lives within its walls, those walls appear as the horizon itself. But history does not recognize permanence. Every ruling order once felt unshakable until the people who sustained it withdrew their consent. You are told the system is too vast to challenge, yet it is vast only because your labor sustains it. You are told change is unrealistic, yet every structure that exists was built by human hands and can be rebuilt by human hands. You are told to wait for reform, yet reform without power leaves the foundation intact. The illusion of permanence dissolves the moment consciousness awakens. When workers understand that their suffering is shared, not personal, structural, not accidental, manufactured, not natural, fear begins to recede. Isolation turns into solidarity. Frustration turns into organization. Organization turns into power. Capital depends on labor. Wealth depends on work. Production depends on participation. And when those who produce the world recognize their collective strength, the balance shifts. Do not underestimate this truth. The system feels permanent because you have been divided. It feels immovable because you have been taught to endure rather than to unite. But unity is not a dream. It is a material force. When workers organize across factories, offices, platforms, and borders, the machinery of exploitation trembles. The future is not written by those who own, it is shaped by those who act. The permanence of injustice survives only as long as it is tolerated. The moment tolerance ends and collective action begins, history accelerates. What once seemed fixed becomes fragile. What once seemed untouchable becomes transformable. Pishore. You are not powerless spectators within an eternal order. You are the creators of wealth, the builders of infrastructure, the drivers of industry, the sustainers of society. Withdraw your obedience and the illusi on collapses. Assert your unity and a new horizon emerges. The system feels permanent until the working class decides it is not.